Herbert and I would like to tell you about how D-Lib magazine helped pioneer much of the scholarly communication landscape that we enjoy today. Our timeline begins in 1991, where Tim Berners-Lee's original vision for the web centered academic information. In 1995, D-Lib magazine began publication and was the focal point for the then emerging digital library community. By 2017, unfortunately, D-Lib magazine had ceased publication, in part because the funding that supported it evaporated, and also in part because the community was mature and diffuse, spread out over the multiple venues that D-Lib magazine helped launch. Herbert and I can offer this perspective about D-Lib magazine in part because we are two of its most prolific authors, with more than 20 publications each, and also in part because D-Lib began during a crucial point in our careers. We were both graduate students and working full-time. I published the journal version of my dissertation in D-Lib, and in fact Herbert's dissertation was largely the concatenation of several influential papers that he had originally published in D-Lib magazine. Now, to be sure, there were plenty of pre-web digital library projects, some of which included things like NetLib, began in the mid-80s by Jack Dongarra at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and it was an email service where you could search and retrieve open source mathematical software through a series of email messages. In 1991, Archive began, run by Paul Ginsberg at Los Alamos National Laboratory, as a similar service where we had subject-based email lists where you could search and retrieve preprints in TeX or LaTeX format. At about the same time, Michael Lesk was doing pioneering work in scanning chemistry journals and evaluating multiple user interfaces for their discovery and display. And of course, every CS department had anonymous FTP servers, where you could download tech reports, what we called preprints. This was an idea that I brought to NASA when I worked there and first started setting up their web-based digital libraries. Of course, in 1993, Mosaic was released and made the web far more accessible than it ever had been, and everything had changed. Mosaic, in conjunction with significant federal funding for digital library research, such as the DLI programs, meant that by about 1994, all digital library projects were web-based. This resulted in things like HTML pages for articles, and these HTML landing pages then would link to the article itself in PostScript or PDF format. And basically we had a web-based automation of existing publication processes. Publishers were quick to adopt the landing page paradigm, where the landing page could function as a gatekeeper and control access to the actual paper, the PDF. And we still see this where DOIs resolve not to the thing, but they resolve to a page that describes the thing. And although some publishers are now following Digital Library D-Lib magazine's lead, for the most part, scholarly communication is still not web-based. We still have PDFs protected by landing pages, and images, video, software, virtual machines, etc. are still separate from the publication and not the publication itself. Now, but let's look back and consider how D-Lib magazine was not just documenting the web and digital library revolution, but was conceived as a publishing experiment that embraced the medium itself. D-Lib magazine was conceived not as a journal, so it did not have things like peer review and editorial boards, but in reality it evolved into a de facto journal, and in a way that its contemporary peers did not. Venues such as Ariadne, First Monday, and the Journal of Digital Information, JODI, were all good journals, and two of them, Ariadne and First Monday, are still in publication. But as the paper details, none of these venues experimented with the web as thoroughly as did D-Lib magazine. Let's also look at the period for which D-Lib magazine sustained this innovation. For over 22 years, 265 issues, and over 1,000 articles, they did this. They published monthly until 2006, where they switched to bi-monthly. And although the early articles were relatively short, it quickly evolved where the word count was similar to half or even two-thirds of an average conference paper. Next, Herbert will detail some of D-Lib magazine's innovations. Herbert?
Yeah, so D-Lib magazine was itself an ongoing experiment in electronic publishing. It initiated quite some innovations, many of which are now best practices in the community. First, of course, D-Lib magazine was always published in HTML. HTML only. There was no PDF version, there was no paper version. There was no landing page, and the persistent identifiers resolved directly to the HTML article. That made the content an integral part of the web, rather than something that was hanging off the web. And that turned out to be a boon for early web crawlers that operated on behalf of search engines, web archives. Now those systems, nowadays, successfully deal with many formats other than HTML, but for a long time, they had a strong preference for HTML only. Interestingly enough, the choice for HTML may no longer be advantageous, at least when academic search engines are considered. That is suggested by looking at search results in Google Scholar for one of our D-Lib papers. The original HTML version only ranks 5th and is preceded by 2 PDF versions of the article, one hosted in an institutional repository and the other in the Internet Archive. Now in position 2 and 3 are metadata records of the article from institutional repositories, and both of these records have links to content with fake handle URIs, so they lead nowhere. In 6th position is an HTML version in an institutional repository, and in 7th, the HTML version of a D-Lib magazine mirror. Note, though, that the HTML version does show up first in a regular Google search. Academic search engines just love them PDFs. Anyhow, the choice for HTML, combined with D-Lib's interest in exploring the boundaries of digital publishing, also allowed authors to experiment with multimedia and interactivity extensions. Michael and I very much appreciated this and frequently took advantage of this possibility. For example, several papers published around '99 that ended up becoming an integral part of my PhD thesis on context-sensitive linking had screen cams. They showed demos of experimental systems at work. One paper included screen cam demos of what would become the SFX linking server, and another, co-authored with Michael, had screen cam demos of the universal preprint service prototype that we created with a few colleagues. The UPS service was a digital library portal with searchable metadata that we manually collected from various preprint systems. We showed the prototype off at the Santa Fe meeting of the Open Archives Initiative, that was October '99, and it motivated the creation of the protocol for metadata harvesting. The screen cams, by the way, were recorded as downloadable exe files, and in order to run them now, one would have to do an emulation. Then there's this 2002 article by Michael that had animations recorded in the more web-friendly MPEG format. They were also provided as downloadable files. I pulled one down the other day and it actually still worked. That's the beauty of standards for you. There's a 2005 article by Michael and our mutual colleague Johan Bollen that didn't use animations, but it actually had 377 images, again stored at D-Lib, linked from the article. That would have been really unwieldy at best in a PDF format. But our most radical experiment is the one in our last article in D-Lib magazine, which looks back at the many information interoperability efforts that we have been involved in over the years. The paper demonstrates so-called robust links at work. Those are links that refuse to die, as we say, because they are annotated with the location of an archived copy of the linked resource and with the datetime that, when using the Memento time travel for the web protocol, can be used to dynamically locate an archived copy of the linked resource in a wide range of web archives. To make these annotated links actionable and yield the link menu that you see in this slide, JavaScript had to be injected in the article. D-Lib just let us do this: annotate the HTML links and inject the JavaScript. In our opinion, this is a very strong illustration of the boutique character that D-Lib had. And we are pretty sure that most of the current big shot HTML journals would not have an appetite for this level of experimentation. We did, however, find another boutique HTML journal, Code4Lib, that was willing to publish articles with robust links. 2 were published thus far, the first one by Sean Jones, that actually describes the robust links approach in detail. D-Lib magazine was an open access journal before the term open access was even coined. Authors retained copyright. Accessing D-Lib didn't require a subscription, and publishing in D-Lib didn't require article processing charges. That was obviously great to attract authors and readers, but predictably, it also meant chronic funding problems once the initial DARPA grant had expired. There was a follow-up grant from the National Science Foundation, but that covered only half of the cost, and CNRI had to contribute the remaining half itself. Subscriptions and author fees were eventually considered but never implemented. And then in 2007, the D-Lib Alliance, membership organization, was created to assist with funding. But funding remained a challenge. And in the final issue of D-Lib, editor Larry Lanham acknowledged that decreased financial support was part of the reason for ceasing publication. He also indicated that it had become harder to attract high-quality articles and that the phrase digital libraries had become a tad redundant. Over the years, D-Lib changed its look several times, as you can see here from the screenshots of articles on this slide. This included changes in background color, font color, and banner, but also, for example, where the persistent identifier could be found and how it was displayed, as I will show later also. But as these changes took place, they were only applied for new articles and were never applied retroactively. That means that articles kept their original look and feel, and as such serve as a monument to the best practices of the time. As a matter of fact, the live web version of one of the articles in the first issue, that's the screenshot to the left here, and the copy that was web archived in 1997, that's the screenshot to the right, are undistinguishable. Using curl to download both versions of this article produces exactly the same MD5 hash. We asked former editors Larry Lanham and Cathy Ray whether this layout persistence was an explicit choice, an official policy. They couldn't remember. We did find a D-Lib guideline from 2000 that indicated that once an issue had been released, only vital corrections or changes would be made, and that these would be noted and dated at the end of the article. Now, this persistence of layout and markup is truly unique when comparing with D-Lib's peers. Ariadne, First Monday, and Jody have all changed their layout over time, for example, when migrating to other platforms. Not only is D-Lib's layout persistent, also their URIs are. All articles starting from the 4th issue, that's October 1995, remain available on the live web at their original URIs. Now we all know that cool URIs don't change, but we also know that URIs actually do. Persisting over 5,000 URIs for more than 25 years is really an accomplishment. And again, none of D-Lib's peers can present a record like this. Over time, their articles have changed domains and or article URIs. It should not surprise us that D-Lib, which is hosted by CNRI, embraced persistent identifiers from the outset. After all, handles were part of the technical infrastructure for digital libraries built by CNRI. Initially, D-Lib uses handles, and starting in '99, that's pretty early, DOIs, which are actually technically a subset of handles. Handles have a bit of a weird relationship with internet standardization in that they are not registered as URM namespaces and they are not URIs. But they can be written as URIs in the info URI namespace, that's one of my more obscure contributions, and they can also be expressed as HTTP URIs. But anyhow, by giving articles a persistent identifier, they became first-class objects. Until then, journals had an identifier, the ISSN, and journal issues had an identifier, the SIGI, but articles didn't. Initially, by the way, D-Lib puts its persistent identifiers at the very bottom of the article, and only later near the top. That's kind of interesting because putting a PID at the bottom would make using them in citations harder. But maybe that's where the trend started for publishers to make the DOIs of their articles unfindable on their landing pages. That was a joke. For a long time, the bits are displayed as strings, something one still sees with many publishers, despite Crossref's 2011 display guidelines that indicate DOIs should be shown as HTTP URIs. D-Lib does follow that guideline starting 2013 for DOIs in references and in 2017 for the DOI of the article itself. Note that of its peers, only First Monday embraced DOIs, most likely somewhere around 2013. Given the community in which D-Lib originated, it also doesn't come as a surprise that attention was paid to metadata. But that was done early on in ways that reveal an understanding of the web, specifically that information consumers on the web include machines. Starting January '99, the HTML meta tag is used to convey the DOI of articles, again listed as a string. And a few months later, a resource auto-discovery technique is introduced to support finding article metadata. It uses the HTML link element with the metadata relation type. The metadata that is linked uses Dublin Core, expressed in XML, that is compliant with a DTD that was defined by D-Lib. The Dublin Core metadata shows the DOI, again expressed as a string, but also includes the HTTP URI of the article. The resource auto-discovery technique used by D-Lib in '99 is commonplace now. There's even an IANA registry for link relation types, and one can now include these typed links in the HTTP link header and even in standalone link set documents. But in '99, that must have been pretty avant-garde. The choice for this follow your nose approach is particularly interesting because around the time that D-Lib started using it, John Kunze was writing an RFC that specified how to embed Dublin Core metadata in HTML. D-Lib didn't, although we can safely assume that the editors were aware of this effort. Maybe their library backgrounds led them to choose an approach that treated metadata as standalone, first class citizens on the web. First Monday did start embedding Dublin Core metadata in HTML with its first issue of 99. We did not find any evidence that Jody or Ariadne provided metadata for machine consumption by that time. Now remember, we're in an era without content distribution networks and with slow internet connections. Repositories such as Archive and D-Lib had established mirror sites on different continents to support faster access and prevent a single system from being overloaded. As far as we know, D-Lib was the first journal to set up mirrors. 5 actually, of which 3 remain operational. Presumably, the mirrors were also used to showcase more advanced handle protocol features, such as multiple resolution, whereby a single handle could resolve to more than one URL. Well, that was it as far as D-Lib's innovations are concerned, and I'm now turning it back to Michael, who will do a deep dive into the first ever issue of D-Lib magazine.
Thank you, Herbert. With 22 years and more than 1,000 articles, it's simply impossible to truly summarize D-Lib magazine's impact. Instead, we will take a deep dive into their first issue, published in the summer of 1995, to reflect on the state of the art some 27 years ago. There were a lot of things in the first issue, announcements, upcoming events, etc., but we'll start with the 3 articles, which were then called Stories and Briefings. The first article was an abbreviated version of the Summary Report of the OCLC NCSA Metadata Workshop held in Dublin, Ohio. It is this workshop that gave rise to what we know today as the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative. You can't pick up a JCDL proceedings without finding several papers still referencing Dublin Core in some fashion. An interesting footnote. Although the link for the original report has long gone 404, though it can be found elsewhere, this article is one of the few places where you can see the original 13 Dublin Core elements defined, not the 15 elements with which we've since become familiar. The second article contains a status update of one of the original 6 DLI projects. As we covered earlier, much of the DLI information has disappeared from the live web. Individual research results remain published throughout the scientific literature, but D-Lib is the only place to get a broad, programmatic view of early DL funding. The University of Michigan project gives a quaint but accurate at the time summary of the web versus traditional libraries. But reading the article also gives a deeper insight into the assumptions about architecture and discovery in the web pre-Google. Building on that idea further is the last article, which reviews the Konwilinski framework. The Konwilinski framework reminds me of the quote attributed to Brian Eno about the band The Velvet Underground. The first Velvet Underground LP sold only 10,000 copies, but everyone who bought it formed a band. You might not have heard of the Konwilinski framework, but it is the basis for a lot of projects that you have heard of. Dienst, OAI PMH, Fedora, and all the resulting repository systems. The Konwilinski framework is still with us in the form of handles, which are the technology upon which DOIs are built, and the repository-centric worldview that eventually led to the tension and split between digital libraries and the web, despite being initially hand-in-hand. The other thing we'd like to cover is the initial Letters to the Editor section, which the editors seeded by soliciting opinions about a research agenda for DLs from 5 prominent researchers and administrators. The editors asked for feedback on the piece, and we're now just getting to it 27 years later. First, Barry Leiner of CNRI spoke about the need for interoperability. This is certainly where Herbert and I have spent the majority of our careers, and while there are successes to point to, it is an ongoing effort because of the forces, primarily economic, that tend towards centralization and homogeneity. Reading Barry's piece, the repository-centric worldview is clear, where a national digital library would be built via the interoperability of many different individual digital libraries. This is opposed to the present day, where a handful of centralized sites provide services not through repository interoperability, but through successful large-scale crawling. Next, Ann Okerson of ARL spoke of the need to integrate electronic and non-electronic content. Note that the adjective digital was not yet fully settled on. Non-electronic collections haven't gone away, and converting them to electronic is asymptotically hard. But the relative sizes of these collections have switched, and libraries are now dominated by their electronic collections. William Shirless of CMU, another initial DLI site, have identified a topic of interest to us still today, our personal digital collections. We've had social media for 15 to 20 years, but I doubt any of us are satisfied with the level of tools and methods for management, discovery, and preservation for our personal content, which is spread out over multiple non-interoperable platforms. Similarly, Paul Evan Peters of CNI identified centering the users in the process, not the resources or services, in what he called distribution chains. We're not 100% sure what he meant by distribution chains, but we think it is also about the users and their tools for the scholarly communications process. We see this as mostly unrealized because despite progress in personal productivity tools, their output and indeed large portions of the actual scholarly communications process remain disconnected from digital libraries and conventional publishing. Finally, James Michalko of RLG, echoing some of Ann Okerson's concerns, focused on the scanning and conversion of the non-digital back catalog. While much remains to be done, we as a community have made great strides here. JSTOR, HathiTrust, Internet Archive, Google Books, and other numerous large-scale projects. In summary, despite ceasing publication in 2017, D-Lib magazine continues to play a central role in the digital library community. D-Lib was innovative, not just documenting the DL and web revolution, but exploring its boundaries as well, such as being open access, HTML-centric, not having landing pages, and expanding the types and scale of media that can appear in scholarly publications. D-Lib is also a time capsule for the DL movement, for example, providing probably the most complete documentation for DLI programs and projects. Looking at just the first issue, we see a review of formats, architectures, and frameworks still with us today. Dublin Core metadata, the Konwalinsky framework, which provides the basis for much of our current repository software, and the pre-Google assumptions about discovery that ultimately led to the DL web schism that our community has inherited. Finally, the What's Needed in Future Research section serves as a useful catalog of the good, the bad, and the ugly of DL progress. The good includes the many successful large-scale scanning and conversion projects that have brought large portions of our back catalog online. The bad includes the lack of tools for managing personal digital content. And the ugly surely includes the never-ending struggle for interoperability. We thank you for your time, and we look forward to your questions.